Yes, Neve Mellerick, Child and Family Support Manager and OT. And thank you so much to Bridget for her lovely introduction, but also inputting to this webinar. Executive functioning is something Bridget and myself have always kind of discussed informally in the office, etc. So it lends itself quite nicely that we would pair up for this one. So the topic is executive functioning focus in the context of navigating school. Navigating school is humongous. It's probably my favorite topic, though I say that about many of them. And I could talk about it all day, all night, and we could probably do a webinar daily on it and not lose speed or fire. But we wanted to really hone in on the executive functioning focus. And Bridget had suggested it as a webinar because often when we talk about school or we talk about home, we end up not getting to the executive functioning bit for some reason. It's like there's a slide on it at the end, and we never really get a chance to go in depth into it. And I suppose showcase it and help parents to understand why it's uh, such an important area and an area they can support their children with. So I suppose when most people hear executive functioning, it often tends to be something they read in the diagnostic report. Lots of you will have waited years to get your child's assessment. You may have ended up paying privately. You may have really skipped to the bottom, to the bit that says, this concludes Bridget is autistic, because that's, the confirmation you've been waiting for, and I suppose the end and a start of a journey for you. I always say to parents, particularly with school, go, and this comes from having written reports, go back up to the recommendations bit, because essentially, I don't mean that's what you're paying for in terms of that's why you went and got the report, but those professional recommendations are based on an assessment of your child's strengths, their areas of needs, and what they'll need in place in school and at home. Too often, parents will say to me, there's actually no mention of the classroom within the report. That can then make things quite difficult when you're applying for school supports, be that an SNA, be that to be in an autism class, a special school, etc. So, kind of as just general advice, we want to make really sure in our professional reports that distinctions are made between home and school and that they're clear and specific when it comes to both of those environments. Somewhere in there, executive functioning might have been mentioned, but a lot of the time, particularly if the child was younger, you'll think, yeah, it's nice about executive functioning, but absolutely, not my priority at the moment. I'm trying to get my child out the door in the morning. I'm very worried about smearing. I'm very worried about bedwetting. I'm very worried about bullying. I'm very worried about sex and consent. And executive functioning doesn't really feel like something that should top that pile or should become the priority. But I think that's where poor old executive functioning is done a bit of a disservice. And it doesn't help that it sounds like, a few men in business suits going off for lunch. And how could that relate to your child? But actually, executive functioning impacts every aspect of our everyday life. There's some exceptions there if we act by reflex, just say we walk in front of a car and jump back, etc. But generally speaking, executive functioning underpins every single task, every single conversation that we're having throughout the day, regardless of age, regardless of cognition, regardless of disability. We all have that in common. And I've heard it described in lots of ways, but the ways that I suppose speaks to me the most, that we can have all our different skill sets, right? So you can be a little bit worried about communication skills, but then at the same time, you're quite worried about toileting skills, but you're also very worried about sensory processing, but you're also super proud of your child for their attention. So you've all these different worries, strengths going on in your head. And the thing that ties all of those together is actually executive functioning. And that's why it's often, compared to the conductor of the orchestra. So, every instrument is playing its piece, but you need one person to bring all of that together. I find explaining executive functioning really boring. So I'm sure to listen to, it's quite boring as well. But I have to give a bit of a flavor to these different skills in order for the suggestions and the strategies to make sense as well and to bring it into your everyday lives. So I think, again, Another sort of, I mean, whoever's doing PR for executive functioning, I don't think is doing fab, because again, when we think of executive functioning, and I even include probably some therapists in this, people often just think planning and organizing. That's what executive functioning is. If you have good executive functioning, then you're an organized person. If you have bad executive functioning, you're a disorganized person. And there's so much more to it than that. And again, it brings it back to that age bit. Because if you're very worried about your child even coping in the school environment, whether they're insanely good at organizing their school bag probably isn't a big worry on your plate. So if we're only thinking about executive functioning in the context of being this super organized type A person, then we're going to lose sight of the way that it impacts every other aspect of our day. And actually, how much of we see of the diagnostic criteria of autism within those different skills within executive functioning. So if you look at the first one there, initiation, all that means there is getting started with a task. And I suppose throughout the presentation, I want you to think in terms of tasks rather than activities. So if it comes into your mind, God, we really struggle with the morning routine, or we really struggle even with dinner time, that's a large activity that is broken in to small tasks throughout. And if we're wanting to support someone's executive functioning, we need to meet them in the middle and understand that part of that activity is maybe 10 to 20 small tasks within, and we need to look at the tasks individually to build for success. If we just look at, I really want to improve the morning routine, we're not going to get anywhere fast. Initiation is a massive one, and that is us getting started with the task itself. But it can also be getting started in a situation, getting started with a conversation. So when we often hear about autistic communication, now this is often coming from a deficit point of view and looking at it through a deficit lens. We hear, not great at chatting to people, not great at communicating. What's often missed there is a person can be an amazing conversationalist, be an amazing playmate with another child, have so much to say, have so many ideas for the game, but really struggle to get started with that conversation, to move from stop to motion, essentially, or if they're in the middle of something else, to stop to move to that conversation. So we hear about communication difficulties, etc., but we rarely think about them from the point of view of, is it the initiation piece that is proving the challenge here? Can we support with getting started or being accommodated to get started? And would that then take away a lot of the anxiety? Planning as well. When we think about planning, we think about leaving cert, history, special topic, big projects. We don't think about planning in terms of, I'm having a shower, I'm brushing my teeth, I'm tying my shoelaces. All of those tasks that we do every day require a level of planning to be able to go through each of the steps of those tasks. And it's not about planning, like you might say, no, my child doesn't really have any cognitive differences. He definitely understands the steps of a shower. There's another reason why he's not showering. And there could be 20 reasons why he's not showering. Sometimes people just don't fancy showering, and lots of other genuine reasons as well. But it's a different thing to understand the steps of a task on a cognitive level. Yes, I understand the steps. And when you're in it, to bring yourself successfully through the steps and maintain energy for that. Shifting is a massive one. So again, we think about the criteria that might have led to your child being formally identified as autistic, and often there'll be a lot of talk about repetitive and restrictive behaviors. And you already know, as I am's view on language like that, we would really be talking about focused and specific interests, and rejecting the pathologizing of that. But what we do know is that an autistic person might find it more difficult to shift attention. So, and really, it can often be unplanned for shifts that are the problem. So if you think about, you actually have two types of executive functioning, our proactive and our reactive. So our proactive is when we know we're going to have to change a plan, say, or change task halfway through. We already know that. We can plan for that. Emerging studies, when we look at the comparison between neurodivergent brains and neurotypical brains, would be that it's actually the reactive executive functioning that can be more of a challenge when the plan changes and for the brain to shift and adjust to that plan. So when we understand that, it will really add weight to why we want to give as much predictability as possible to an autistic person. Working memory as well. The best way I think of working memory is post-its in the brain. So working memory is different to long-term memory. Autistic people often have amazing strengths in long-term memory. They could hear the tune of a song once, and I bet some of you are thinking of this with your own kids, and be able to repeat it forevermore. They could hear a line from an ad and hear it once on the radio in Granny's car and be able to script that line back and back and back and back again. So they've encoded that into their long-term memory. What might be more difficult is when we think of our working memory. Okay, I've remembered that I want to say to you guys about objects of reference on this call. So I've posted in my brain for that. But as the call comes, I also think, God, I also want to talk to you about level of prompting, and I add to that post-it. So the post-it is being continually added to over the day. And that's what can be difficult for neurodivergent people. That idea of working memory when more and more and more information comes at us and information we didn't plan for. We need to understand things like that in order to be able to present instructions to a child, and also to make sure that our expectations are reasonable for a child. If we're trying to get them to do something new in the evening, like learn toothbrushing, for example, on a Thursday evening when they've had a day of post-its being added to and added to, really they might be out of available post-its for that new information for their working memory. And then finally, emotional regulation. A big part of that conductor of the orchestra there is helping us, I suppose, how would I say, not lose our temper, lose our patience, etc. Remain on task, not get distracted by the emotions that are taking us over. And this is where you kind of have your cool executive functioning and what's often called as your hot executive functioning. And the way I would explain this would be, if your friend said to you, my dear God in heaven, my mother-in-law is driving me mad whenever she suggests that the baby really needs to have a bib on or she's going to get a bad chest. It's very easy to say, okay, next time she says that, just say, this is something that really works well for baby Bonnie, and I think we're doing okay. When you're in the moment and your emotions are challenged, it is not so easy to disinhibit. It is not so easy to think about, okay, I know my mother-in-law actually means well, so what would be a reasonable thing to say here? For that conductor to step in and say, okay, let's actually think about, is it going to be worth it if I lose my temper here? We've got 3 more days in this Airbnb and it's going to be really awkward. When we're in that space of heat, our conductor gets a lot quieter and fades out, and we think, screw it, I'm saying it. Exact same for a child. So when we think about executive functioning, we also should think about it in terms of emotional responses, be that to demands, be that to transitions, be an activity ending, that we can teach a child, when the timer finishes, we're going to put away Barney. But actually, and the child can say, yeah, lovely. When the timer finishes, we're going to put away Barney. The reality of the feeling when Barney gets put away and the wondering when Barney's coming back means we may not always respond in the most sensible way that we know how. So when we often hear the line, he knows better than that, she knows better than that. Yes, she knows better than that when her emotions aren't completely heightened. Okay, so that, I suppose, hopefully has sort of I've tried to mention a good few things that you'll think, oh, my child does that, or sometimes that happens with my child, to be able to bring into focus that actually executive functioning is something you think about with your child every day, just not always with a name. And I suppose, like we said, it is very helpful to think about executive functioning from that lived experience point of view. So, Bridget, you're going to speak to us now for a moment.
So I'm Bridget Farrell. I work for As I Am on the info line, and this is a 5-year-old Bridget Ratliff going to her first day of kindergarten in the US. And I wasn't diagnosed until I was 23. So my entire school career, we had no idea what was going on. I was given an assessment when I was 12, but I was told I invalidated the test. So we have no idea what's going on the entire time. I struggled a lot with routine stuff. Like I did well at projects when it's an event, I can do it, but like homework was very hard. You have to do a book report every month was very hard. I got lots of notes that I was never prepared for class. And my mom, especially, was very keen to fix it. And so every new idea of how to make me more organized and more able to start, as Neve put it, was a big event that we're starting this new planner and it's going to change your life. And I fill it up a quarter of the way and I forget to do it for a day and I feel like a failure and I can't go back to it because it's the restarting after you fail. And that happened with extracurriculars as well. Like a lot of sports, I'd get really into it. And then I'd miss a week because I was sick and I felt like everyone was way ahead of me and I can't get back into it because it stopped. And that became very hard, especially in university, where it's very easy to skip a class and no one's going to come find you. No one's going to tell your mom. And that became a big problem for me. It expands out. I was very messy. I'm still quite a bit messy. I have one of the messier desks in As I Am, and that's not going to change. I had an insanely messy room. My mom only had one rule for my room eventually, which was that there has to be a path from the door to my bed. So if there's a fire or they need to get me into an ambulance, they can reach me. And I didn't always make that rule. So with all of this put together and no answer for why this was happening, I thought I was stupid and I thought I was lazy, and the people around me thought I was lying because, like Neve said, I have a very good memory. I have, I can remember storylines and plots from movies and shows that I haven't seen in decades. I can remember the meaning of the name of everyone that I meet. And I absolutely did genuinely forget that I had a book report due yesterday. That's not a lie. So this little girl made through 13 years of school and had no idea what was happening. So I think it's very valuable to be able to know that this is because they're autistic. This is because they're having trouble with executive function. And I think it's also one of the reasons that it's very good to disclose to your kids that they're autistic, because you knowing doesn't mean that they know. And you can impart a lot of good feeling onto them, but they also get the feeling of everyone at school who thinks that they're stupid and lazy and lying because what they're doing doesn't make sense in a neurotypical world. So if I could give her one thing, it's the knowledge of what's going on. And I will pass back to Neve.
Thanks, B. I have to say your haircut inspired your not your current haircut and your past haircut.
It
It's
was 2001, not to date myself.
listen, still young. And I think that's what we're really going to try and drive home and touch upon, throughout this presentation, the power of understanding the difference and the power of being able to self-advocate for that difference. Because if you don't learn that you have a difference in characteristics to other students in your class, or a different way of experiencing learning till you are in university, it is a rapid ascent into suddenly advocating for yourself. And having worked in a university, but also, having linked in with families so much, that comes through a huge amount where, a parent has been a fierce advocate for a child, and, which is such an admirable thing. But then the child might go to university, say, and suddenly they're alone in the office with the disability manager or the disability advisor, having to explain their strengths, their needs, the accommodations they require. But you can't begin to have that conversation until, I suppose, a child understands why those accommodations might need to be in place. So we're really going to try and drive that home. I just wanted to say before we move on as well, in every context, or every example I give, rather, there is context here. So when we think about executive functioning, when I was being trained, it was really, really explained to me as a difficulty. It was actually thought to me as executive dysfunction. And when we were taught how to support the child with that, it was basically with a fix it approach, memory training, visual perceptual training, etc., which there is very little evidence to say makes a difference, because we are looking at different brain chemistry, aren't we? But also, there's also a move now to a strengths based approach, which obviously all of us, it'd be a little bit funny to say I'm not a fan of a strengths based approach. But I know for so many people, they say, okay, yes, fair enough. But actually, my executive functioning differences do cause me quite a lot of stress. And sometimes it can be patronizing for things to be reframed, when sometimes you just want to say, no, I actually find this quite stressful. In this situation, I find my, difficulty in switching focus when I'm driving, when I'm learning to drive, actually, I'm just finding this really stressful. And this does feel like a difficulty. So, actually, really, I want to look at executive functioning in a more neutral context, because it is so dependent on the context. So, for the individual who's learning to drive and is finding it really difficult to shift focus when they see cars oncoming, etc., yeah, that's a difficulty. It's hard to wrap it up. However, when we think of autistic thinking styles like monotropism, that absolutely amazing ability to focus in on something so in depth and go into that hyper focus, be able to research, examine, play, look at something with such depth, that's going to be a massive strength in so many contexts. And I was trying to think of an example of this, and I was thinking of, let's call him your man Edison. That seems quite disrespectful. But when we think of a lot of the big inventors in our past, even if we think of people like neurosurgeons, etc., we really don't look back and be like, kind of wish, a little bit weird how obsessed you were with that. You spent a little bit too much time on that. In context, Edison's hyper focus changed the world. I can't say anything about how he learned to drive or his executive functioning, but in other contexts, that maybe in a social relationship sometimes, that might have presented as a challenge. And that's what we want children to understand. Their executive functioning themselves, we're not thinking about superheroes or anything like that. We're thinking of it in terms of, in this situation, that can make that quite hard. In this situation, my God, that's a massive strength for you. Okay, in the situation that it does make things quite hard, what do you need there? What's going to help you learn better there? So it's that balance of the two. Okay, so a big question always when we present on any type of skill is, of course, well, what supports should my child have in school? And actually, we get the question a lot more generally. We get the question in terms of what supports should an autistic child have in school, which lends to thinking that there's almost a list. And God, this would make life so easy when your child gets diagnosed if you could just be sent a list of as I am of supports, go into the meeting and ask for them. What complicates it is that from a legal point of view, from a policy point of view, from a therapeutic point of view, there is no set list, because the supports that are put in place are based on what in school, now I'm speaking specifically, are based on what the barriers are to your child accessing the curriculum. So without trying to be some kind of amateur Gareth Noble here, when we think about education and our constitutional rights, one of our two rights there is to access the curriculum. Anyone who's been to talks on school with me before is like, yes, 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 Neve, I get it. But I think that the access to curriculum one doesn't get the attention it deserves by a range of people. Because I think when we see it, we think, oh, yeah, yeah, as I am says, my child has a right to access the curriculum. Yeah, yeah, she's in third class, she's accessing the curriculum. But if your child is sitting in third class and the noise of the overhead fan is completely distracting them, and the smell of Jimmy beside them, who's started wearing strong aftershave, is distracting them further, and they have to write and their hand is getting tired, more tired than the child beside them, they are not experiencing the same chance to engage in the curriculum. They are not being left with room to think, ooh, what is a good idea for that question? Or do I recognize that picture? Is that the color red? Is that the color blue? So, whatever level they're at, it doesn't matter. They're not getting the same chance in that way. If they're not presenting with any differences in school because they're so fixated on hiding and camouflaging and masking, they're still not getting the same chance in theory to access the curriculum, because all of their attention is going to don't stim, don't do anything to look different, don't make any strange movements, don't do anything that might make me stand out. Again, not a lot of thinking time left for what's the teacher actually asking me to do. So, really, when we think about the recommendations that are in our professional reports, if I could go back in time to writing those reports, I would support them always with this child requires X to access the curriculum. It's not very therapeutic language, but actually, it's the therapeutic and education having to come together there. So, really, what you as the parent wants to know is what accommodations, reasonable accommodations, can be implemented to remove or reduce those barriers. And I think executive functioning barriers often are last in the race. We talk about the noise of the classroom and having ear defenders. We talk about movement breaks because we need more vestibular input. We talk about small class sizes to reduce the noise. We very rarely discuss, okay, what's the barriers to my child initiating the task? What's the barriers to my child's working memory when they're learning how to write? Okay, what is the barrier to my child shifting topic when they are doing Irish tape and then they say, oh, I'm showing my age, it's definitely not called tape now, and then they're moving to Irish writing all in the one lesson. What supports are in place for that? What reasonable accommodations are in place for that? And before we look at that more, I'm going to sort of take us off course just for a brief minute, but I thought it was probably the best place to mention this. Because yes, this is school focused, and yes, your child has a right constitutionally to access the curriculum. Relationships are obviously connected to that, but not connected. I would argue that and I'm sure lots of you on the call would agree, that if you have positive relationships with the staff in school, with the other children, you're going to be a lot more free, comfortable, and safe to learn. So when you think about your child's support needs in school, I'm coming at it primarily from a learning point of view when I speak to some of the advocacy questions you can ask. But I just think for food for thought, let's look at it from the point of view of relationships for a moment. So I've covered that initiation piece. I have a really strong memory of a teenage boy I worked with who My God, we used to have the best crack in his individual OT sessions. I would be hooting laughing. Um, but he would spend much of his lunchtime alone. But if another child invited him over and started a conversation with him, he would thrive. But he was waiting for the people he kind of named as friends in his head, and they were his friends. And actually, I'm still in touch with him as an adult, and they are all still friends, I believe. But he would be waiting for that initiation to be done for him, not because, he thought he deserved an exclusive invite every day, but because, like Bridget referred to, that getting started just felt like he was in stuck gear. So that's obviously going to impact. That's also going to impact when a child needs to ask for help when they're stuck in a lesson. When we give visual guides to our activities and as I am, we deliberately put in things like what to do if you need the toilet, whether you can have a drink of water, whether you can have a snack, etc. All the things that I envision a child sitting there having the language to say, can I have water, please? Or to sign toilet, please? Or to use their AAC device to communicate toilet, please? But actually, to initiate, who do I say that to? Who is that conversation with? Do I go up? Do I call out? Do I put my hand up? There is so much to the initiation piece there. So if we just teach asking for help as a skill that is just our verbal, our sign, our AAC, what's the problem? The problem is getting started with that and knowing who to approach and knowing how to approach them as well. Conversational, then, a lot of people will say, sometimes they might be considered by friends as interrupters or poor listeners because they jump in with their point. And that can be something that if you don't understand, can be assumed to be maybe quite rude, or maybe might make the other person feel that they're not being listened to. I have a family member who's neurodivergent, and this would be a big one when the two of us are out walking. But I know she's interrupting me because she will forget what she's going to say if she doesn't say it right there and then. Because of working memory, coping with all the sensory stimuli, unless she says it to me right there and then, she's forgotten it. And it's usually her trying to give me helpful advice that she's worried she'll forget if she doesn't say out loud. If I didn't have that understanding, or if she didn't have the insight to that she does that, then there would be some communication probably difficulties there. I understand why she's doing it, and she has also got used to advocating for herself and saying, I know I interrupt. What I'm worried about is X, Y, and Z, and taking it as it comes. In terms of conversational shifts, then, so what a lot of kids will say to me is they're sitting in a conversation and everyone's talking about um, Japanese, Korean food. We were talking about that in our lunch club today, and they have a fact to give about Korean lunch club. But suddenly, Neve changes the conversation and says, "Has anyone else tried Japanese food though?" And bam, we're on to Japanese food. And then the individual says, when I went to the Korean restaurant, X, Y, and Z happened. And that's understood as only wants to talk about what he wants to talk about, isn't actually listening to the rest of us. Rather than when we go back to that executive functioning skill of shifting, still being in a loop of Korea being talked about and not having the processing time to think about, we've now moved on to Japan. So you can see how that impacts socially, even though it's an executive functioning skill. The get me out of here one, and I talk about this a lot when talking to parents of teenagers. When we think of that proactive or predictive executive functioning, it's when we're going into a situation where, say, we know there's going to be a planned interruption, right? So I know I'm working on this presentation, but I know that I have ordered Deliveroo. So I know I haven't, by the way, but I wish I had. I know at some stage there's going to be a doorbell ring, and I'm going to have to leave, say, get that imaginary delicious pizza, bring it back, and be able to return the call. So I still might get quite distracted, but I've been able to prepare myself. Reactive, then, which is the one that unfortunately we experience all of the time, is when we don't know that a difficulty, a decision is coming that we're going to need to make in the moment, and we won't be able to prepare for what to do for that. You can't prepare your child for every eventuality where they will have to make a snap decision without you. But what you might need to do, perhaps more than other parents, is talk some of those scenarios through. And this comes up with peer pressure all of the time. So, for example, if your child is in a situation where alcohol is offered and they don't want to try the alcohol. Now, there's another scenario where they do want to try the alcohol, but let's say in the scenario they don't. But they haven't had preparation for this. They haven't had a chance to process what the other person has said and plan what would be a suitable response. So they may just end up saying yes. So the get me out of here can be really important for once your child starts socializing away from you. And that's going to be whether it's in school or that's going to be whether it's wherever kids hang out. So an example could be, and one that Amanda McGuinness often refers, that I think her dad taught her, was about having a tummy ache. I suppose the art of a white lie. And that was a trusted thing when she felt uncomfortable in a social situation. She didn't have to do a huge amount of planning. She had one line she could come back to. So she could link, I'm not in a good situation here, and say, I'm not feeling very well, I'll have to go. An alternative that a parent suggested to me was a child saying, oh, I don't actually like whatever it is, so I won't be able to try X, Y, and Z. Everyone will have individual parenting styles and how far that they want to go with these kind of things. But the point is, if your child is going to find it more difficult to imagine what might happen in a social scenario, so let's say their first disco, maybe other kids, they're going to discuss it with their friends, what happens at the disco, maybe they're going to make some links between TV, etc. If your child is going to find it difficult to imagine what might happen there socially, there may be a place for you to talk through that. The same in terms of going for help. So they have an accident in school. They get their period unexpectedly. They forget their homework journal, whatever it is. Thinking about it's particularly in a new school year, a new setting. What are the problems that might manifest themselves? And have you talked through the scenario? The benefit of talking through the scenario as well is, for a child who does have difficulties in planning, talking through adds another layer of support. So instead of us just thinking about a solution, if we talk about it out loud, we hear ourselves. So we're giving ourselves a boost of audio there. We're not just having the imagination of the visual spatial, imagining myself in the situation. Once you have you ever said to someone, do you know what I'm going to do if my boss says to me, I'm going to say X, Y, and Z? And you feel better after the conversation because you've talked it out and you think, okay, actually, do you know what? I've talked it out to myself. The same here applies to a child, but perhaps even more so. Further to that, then, in how a teacher can be cued or SNA or so on, as kids get older, or maybe from a very young age, really, really worry about looking different. And I say this all the time, hats off to a child who can feel confident to look and be different. That is a big ask in where school can be a little bit of a jungle, and as that one teenager once said to me, my mom always says I should be proud of being different, but my mom looks like her friends, talks like her friends, dresses like her friends, and does all the same thing as her friends. So why do I got to be different? And I thought, like, touche, actually, how many of us as adults are that confident at being different? So if you know your child is going to maybe struggle to ask for help in school or worry about asking for help in school, how can they cue the teacher? So I know one child who had on their journal, for example, so just say they had a red cover on the back of their journal, they would turn that over on the desk to cue the teacher. I heard of another scenario where a child would change the colors of pens on their desk to cue to the teacher, or would say to the teacher, I need help with X, which was something else, but really could be help with what they don't want people to know. So it's working, I suppose, with the teacher on how is your child able to cue that they need help. Okay. So coming back now to when we think about the more learning style of school, and I want to just speak to the reasonable accommodations bit here, because I think sometimes parents get worried about reasonable accommodations, and they're almost in this weird competition versus goals. The therapy world is obsessed with goals. I'm sort of hoping um, any of the OTs who are on the call are thinking, my God, is she going to start raining down on goals? Goals have their place, accountability, etc. But it's rare that a child who doesn't have a disability has goals set for them. You hardly hear Mary at the playground saying, I've been setting some goals for Bobby's social interaction. By week 4, I'd really like her on 3 out of 4 occasions to be greeting you when she gets into the car. You don't hear that kind of thing. It's really often only children with disabilities who are given these goals. And that in part is because of the service providers working with them, and to make the service provider accountable rather than the child, to give evidence of their therapy. But there can often be this worry that if you put reasonable accommodations in place for your child, this will stop them becoming successful or independent in the task. If we make the task easier, if we take away the difficulty of the task, the child is going to get lazier. Or, my God, when he's 30, I won't be able to give him a visual schedule for, the morning routine. What's he going to do when he's 30? With children who don't have a disability, we rarely feed into thinking about what's it going to look like when he's 30. Because when he's 30, there'll probably be a robot living with him who tells him how to get through his morning routine, because will have been taken over by AI. But the idea of reasonable accommodations is to enable your child to do the thing. And I'll break that down just a little bit further. So it's thinking of that independence versus success. So if I wanted to learn to bake a cake without looking at the steps of the recipe, okay, so that's my goal. I want to bake a cake, beautiful cake like that, and I don't want to look at the steps of the recipe. I absolutely, the first time, the second time, the 20th time I did it, would have the recipe. I would have the strategy with me. I would have the accommodation with me. Because how else am I going to get to the place, if it's possible for me to be able to bake the cake without the recipe, if I'm not getting used to all the other aspects of the task? So by having the recipe in place, my motor memory has got used to the stirring of the whisk. My visual perception has been supported because I'm looking for items in the cupboard. My shifting of attention has been supported because I'm having to shift from that to putting it in the oven, etc. So we get so obsessed with this notion of the child being able to do something by themselves as the marker of success, and we forget that actually, reasonably in the world, we are interdependent rather than independent. In most things we do, whether that be at work, at home, etc., we do it in a group, we do it in a team, and we learn how to use the support that we need, because that is a really important skill. So when you're thinking about accommodations being put in place for your child, this is not your child taking the easy way out. This is putting the things in place that will enable them to succeed in the task by their own merit. So, Bridget, I will hand over to you here.
So when Neve asked me to put together some slides for this from an autistic perspective, I went back to a folder that my mom created when I was growing up of essentially every academic document that was sent home by the school. It has all my report cards, all of my IEP meetings, and some of the things that were said about me and to me were bizarre and came from this idea that no one knows why this is happening and no one knows how to support the fact that this is happening. The summary is would be a great student if she only applied herself, as if I wasn't, that I was clearly skating by, and I'm very smart. So there's no reason for me to be smart and also not good at school. A history class that I took in secondary school, I remember it's a class that myself and my sibling, who's also neurodivergent, they're dyslexic, dyspraxic, ADHD. And it's a class that you take the class, and then at the end of the class, you have a big test to prove how well you did in the class. And if you do really well in that test, you get college credit. And I failed the class and aced the test and got the college credit. And my sibling aced the class, failed the test, and didn't get the college credit. So we essentially proved the class null and void. And I was getting back onto doing classwork after having a really hard time. And I handed in this um, paper on westward expansion. And she refused to accept it and said, "It doesn't matter how good it is, and I will not grade it because it is late. And it is much more important for it to be on time than for you to know what's going on and to be able to articulate that." Another problem that I have, that I continue to have, is that I hate busy work with the power of 1,000 suns. And it's something in primary school and secondary school that I think teachers must be aware that children know that some of this is busy work, that some of this is very important, but some of it just isn't. And my mother and I had a discussion actually about which of my wildly busy work assignments that I simply refuse to do. Because which one to include, because it's when you're putting so much effort into getting any of this done, the silliest ones always fall to the bottom. And this was a health class for middle school, and Kanye West had just gotten on stage and yelled at Taylor Swift at the VMAs, and I was supposed to write a paper about how that linked in with what I'm learning in health class, and I did not. And the note that I did not do that made it onto my report card for the year, which is wild because that's a silly assignment. And it doesn't prove what I do or do not know about health class. It just proves that I didn't watch the VMAs. Another history teacher, a better history teacher, seemed to notice the pattern that I am very good at tests. I know all of this information. None of it is about information not going in. I'm very smart. I know history, especially history. History has always been a special interest. But I just don't do my classwork and I don't do my homework because it's this repetitive, energy sucking thing that's so forgettable and losable. But I think it's all wrapped up in that, what that psychologist who said I invalidated the ADOS when I was 12 said, which I believe is the most wildly rude thing that anyone has ever said to a 12-year-old, is that I was choosing this. I was choosing being lazy. I was choosing being stressed and anxious and scared, that I was choosing this because that little 12-year-old knew it would be harder to not choose this. It would be harder to be good. So I was avoiding being good because it would be hard, which is ridiculous. And man, if I could find that guy's house. I will pass off to Neve, and next time you see me, I will be giving solutions rather than telling you what teachers said.
And she confirms that she's not looking for anyone's house.
Ah,
She's in Dublin and they're in the US of A. But
they are safe
I
and sound.
Safe and sound. And I think I was before I move on, a lot of what Bridget said there is going to link in to what I think is the helpful approach for advocating for your child in this topic. Just wanted to hit on some of the other common worries that can come through from parents on executive functioning, just to maybe jolt the brain, etc. Morning routine is a massive one, getting up and out the door, transitioning to secondary school and suddenly having to manage, remembering to put items in a locker, remembering to bring items to class, transitioning to academic work that needs you to, it's not an immediate answer, you need to plan out an answer. So something like composition, remembering to drink your juice or your water throughout the school day, remembering to have your coat in your hands when you go out to the playground, playground, uh, remembering that you need to go to the toilet when you need to pee, but you're doing something that's really fun and enjoyable. Project work that has multiple parts and can be interpreted differently. Making sure that everything is in your school bag, keeping track of, did you bring home your PE runners or your PE trousers? Toileting, I've mentioned that. Showering as well, going through all the steps of showering and not just being in and out of there in about 10 seconds flat and not looking any the cleaner. So there are some of the worries that link to executive functioning that we would hear. Bridget mentioned this in her first slide. I am reasonably assured by numerous neurodivergent people that being asked, have you tried just something crazy? Maybe just write it down in a new planner is really a red rag and rather triggering, for want of a better word. But actually, if we bring it back to the skill of executive functioning and where the various skills in that, we can also just think about why it's a little bit patronizing, but also why it isn't always the best advice to consider a planner. Now, if a planner works for your child, don't break what's not, don't fix what's not broken. And similar to anything we say tonight, if it's working, keep doing it. But if you think of maintaining a planner, and Bridget referenced this, if she missed one day getting started again, remembering where your planner is, remembering to have your planner on your person, remembering to write in your planner, remembering to check your planner, remembering to bring your planner home. You are actually adding multiple demands to the child's day. So if your child just consistently has not got on board with the planner approach, they probably don't yet have the reasoning skills, like any child wouldn't, to explain why that's not working for them. They might just say, stupid planner, I hate my planner. But actually, there is valid reasons why they might hate said planner. So I just wanted to highlight that quickly. And really, again, me and Bridget are very much on the same page here when it comes to not a choice. So often you will get reports from school where executive functioning is described like a behavior. He fails to attend to his written work. She chooses to not pay attention. She would prefer to be doodling rather than listening to the teacher. All of the discussion around executive function often refers to those who have good or typical executive functioning, that they wake up and they choose to be really organized, they choose to manage their time well, they choose to be well kept out, and they choose to get their work done on time. And that everybody else who has poor executive functioning simply doesn't. It almost becomes this sort of morality issue that starts when we're so young but then travels up through adulthood. So, really, when you're thinking of advocating for your child around the topic of executive functioning, really you're advocating to accommodate. It is not to say that a child's executive functioning won't evolve and develop. Our brains don't stop developing till they're into adulthood. So it would be ridiculous for me to say the way it is now is the way it is. However, what we do know is saying to a child, you need to do better, you need to become more organized, you need to become less forgetful. If you forget your book, then you lose lunchtime. If you remember your book, then you gain lunchtime. Actually doesn't tie in at all to how our executive functioning skills develop. So, really, when you're thinking about advocating for your child in this topic, you are thinking about what are the reasonable accommodations that should be in place for them so that they have the best opportunity to learn, to feel safe, to be social, all of the things you want for them in school. Maybe not too social. I'd say my parents could have wanted me to reduce the socializing in school. The first one, I made it big so I don't so I don't forget. You want to ensure that your child's executive functioning profile, needs, differences, strengths, etc., are included in their professional documentation. Often it's considered in that initial diagnostic report. If your child then sees an occupational therapist for a block of sessions about sensory processing, say, if you have a review of your child's educational needs before they go into secondary school, be that privately through the CDNT, NEPS, etc., ask about executive functioning. Make sure that that is explored, assessed, and documented within the assessment report so that you can bring that information to the school. Often, when you're advocating for your child in a school meeting, it's easy to get caught up in the discussion, your nerves around the discussion, how you're coming across, worrying, are you coming across neurotic? It can be much easier if you have the objective information there in front of you highlighted. And then, where are you seeing that information? So, forget executive functioning for a moment. Any of the child's recommendations in your report that you have likely paid quite a considerable sum for, where are you seeing them in their school support plan, in their IEP, in their personal learning intentions, etc.? Because surely those professional recommendations should be making their way into the rest of the school paperwork. So, the first advice I would give you, make sure that executive functioning is being paid attention to in your child's assessments, support, etc., and then that is repeated in their support plans. So there isn't wiggle room for that language of she chooses to be lazy to get in there. Right, I'm going to have to move my face so I can see my slides. I think about it as posing questions, okay? So the accommodations are there, but sometimes you want to pose questions to the teacher, to the SNA, whoever it is, or you want your child to maybe be able to ask for these things as well. And they depend on level of schooling. We know that lots of autistic kids have a processing difference, so they have reduced processing speed. That does not mean that the child is less intelligent or has a lower IQ. Literally, what it means is there is a slower time for them to process verbal information, visual information, and motor information. So the motor movements someone is making, sometimes all three, sometimes one, sometimes two, etc. So if they're sitting in a class, it is likely that maybe after the class that they then have the question, wait, when's that due? Or what does he want us to do for that history project? Or what picture did she want me to color? Whatever it is. So does your child have a route to ask questions after the lesson or after the school day has taken place? That's an accommodation. How can they go back once they've processed what's happened? Likewise, are they getting that time to process? Little Betty seems to be ignoring me when I ask her a question. Little Betty just seems to be repeating whatever choice I give her. How much time is your child being given to process verbal instructions, written instructions, whatever the instructions are? We often, I remember when I was younger, speech and language therapists used to describe it as the neurotypical pause, that we will give an instruction and then we'll become awkward that there's no response. So we'll fill the silence. So we'll say, Jimmy, did you understand what you need to do? Jimmy, are you clear on what you need to do? Jimmy, have you got your copybook? And then we've given all that extra language to process. We're often very uncomfortable just waiting for the person to respond to us, whether that be pointing to a picture, whether that be using their device. We will fill that silence with another option. If you are told, he seems not really to be understanding these concepts, how is the information being presented? Has it just been presented in terms of auditory instructions? Has your child been able to see it written down? Has it just been written down on the whiteboard where your child wouldn't have attended that they needed to link what was on the board to them? Or has it been written down individually on their desk so they can keep referring back to it? Have they been given start points rather than the end goal? So if they're a little bit older and they've been asked to complete an essay over the next 3 weeks, that end goal is probably not specific enough. That's going to be a difficult thing to manage from a time point of view. So have they been given starting points? Like by Wednesday, you need to start to come up with the character you want to write the story about. By Saturday, you need to have considered your introduction. Or has it just been that essay needs to be due in 2 weeks' time, and now that essay is repeatedly late? Can we think about, and Bridget touched on this, mastered rather than done? So if we know the child has understood a topic and has understood that 2 + 2 = 4, has understood a much more complex algebra situation that I can't even begin to think of, sometimes we're obsessed with that being communicated by writing. How else can your child communicate that they have mastered something, that they have understood something? So if all the energy they have given into the lesson is listening to the teacher, processing it, and actually for them having a conversation with the teacher that demonstrates their understanding, signals that they have mastered something, is there a need to put in an additional demand there? And if so, why are we putting in that additional demand? When I say tried and tested there, I don't mean tried and tested strategies. What I mean is, in terms of advocating for your child, they say that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So if you keep hearing every time you go to the parent teacher meeting, we're still using the planner with Jimmy, but he's still doing blah, blah, blah. We're still using uniform tokens with Mary, but she still doesn't remember to put on her tie. As an advocate for your child, it is really important to say there that strategy has now been tested. It is not proving effective with my child. I think the reasons are, and they could be linked to executive functioning, communication, social interaction, etc. What other strategy are we going to try? It is so unfair in kids that when something isn't working for them, it is just tried and tried and tried, that we hope we will just break them down. I'm mindful of time, Bridget, don't worry, but I'm near to the end. The script is really, really, really important. This one's a massive one for me. I am very dyspraxic. If I am going to be going to something new where I'll have to do a lot of thinking, it is really, really helpful for me from a motor point of view. And bear in mind, I'm not going to give the exact statistic because I'll get it wrong. A high percentage of autistic people are considered that they would meet the criteria for dyspraxia. So just bear that in mind. It is really helpful for me to see pictures of a new situation, not because I'm worried about what might happen there. So when we think of social stories or so on, we often think about the child needing to know what will happen, who will be there, etc. For me, I'm looking at, will I have to walk up the stairs? Will I have to open a difficult looking door? I'm working out the motor plan for myself. I have a really strong memory in first year after doing my taster day, begging my sister to draw me a map to get to the locker room. It was literally 10 steps in, then to the right. But I could not remember what we had seen on Friday. And I had this vision that I was going to be humiliated, unable. And I asked her, would she count the steps and tell me how many steps I could take? My graduation, I asked my best friend who was graduating the week before, could she tell me exactly how many steps I was going to have to go up to take my certificate? I was losing sleep over doing the walk in front of people anyway, but if I had an idea of the motor plan in place, that would reduce some of the stress. We talked about the advantages of talking through a plan. So have you said to the teacher, okay, she struggled with that. Were you able to talk through that with her? Did she have a chance to say those instructions out loud? We know that for kids with executive functioning differences, that a change in routine is very, very difficult because it requires them to make sudden, unexpected shifts while still sequencing through a task that now looks different and has a motor difference. So have they got a sub teacher in and now the morning routine is different? Is lunchtime routine different, etc.? what should work look like at the end is an important one. If your child has been given a big project or a craft project or been asked to paint a picture, have they been showed what it looks like at the end so they can visualize what the end product is rather than having to imagine those steps? And is the task conducive to their task completion style? So a child might be someone your child might be someone who has a sequential task style. I have a sequential task style. I like to work through things from start to finish. Probably because I am so dyspraxic, I have to be really rigid and controlled. So I like things to follow a logical order. And if I'm working on a project with someone, I want it to be logical. Somebody else might have what's called a simultaneous task approach. So that might mean when they're cleaning the house, they go to pick up the bin and then they notice, God, the sink's filthy. So then that cues them to clean the sink. And then they think, my God, we haven't got any cloths. And then they go on to Tesco to order a cloth. So they have a simultaneous task completion style rather than a sequential. There is no point going against someone's natural task completion style. So, actually, if your child is struggling to get through tasks in the classroom, have a conversation about when they do successfully complete a task of their own choosing, how are they getting through that and how can that be generalized? I think I just wanted to include a partners in crime sign or a slide because I think when it comes to executive functioning, particularly when your child is at school all day, you really are like their partner in crime. So when you think about how much thinking, shifting, initiation, memory is going to be required of them in school, how can we make the morning and the evening look different? So if your child is someone who struggles entirely with the morning routine, I'm going to say something controversial here, but if they're showered and they're clean the night before and you cannot get them out the door in the morning, what is the massive harm in them going to bed in their uniform if that will take out one demand for the next day and stop them expending so much energy on that? If the planning of sitting down with porridge, then adding blueberries, then so on, is going to again expend energy, is Monday to Friday okay if they have the type of breakfast that you just pick up and you put in your mouth and no further tasks are required? How can you minimize the energy they expend in the morning and drop a few standards? Multiples. I'm not suggesting you go and you buy your child 75 iPhones on the chance that they might lose them. But if they're finding it really difficult to remember what's in school, what's at home, and there isn't a huge cost to this, why can't there be their home station for their school bits and their school station for their school bits? Is that the priority at the moment? Because it's thinking about that priority. Is the priority them remembering everything they need to do? In terms of body doubling, this is something that comes up a lot in the neurodivergent world. So that idea of if your child has to get through a task, maybe you want them to tidy their room by themselves, and they say, but hey, could Mary come over and sit in my bed while I tidy my room? And you're like, no, because tidying your room is not supposed to be a fun thing. You should have done it. But we know from so many autistic adults' accounts that having someone there, not doing the same thing, because the child probably will not want someone to touch their stuff, but having someone there in the room often acts as a prompt for them. So if your goal was the room to be tidied, what's the harm if someone was there alongside them? I've touched on routines as well. Stage of life, very quickly. Emotional maturity. It's very easy for me to say, you know what, Neve, if you prep your lunches ahead this week, your skin will glow from all the vegetables. You'll get an extra 15 minutes in bed. I have the abstract thinking, the reasoning, the emotional maturity, depending on the week, to plan ahead like that. We cannot expect a child, when it comes to their executive functioning, to be able to think of their future self. Amazing if they can do it, but not really a skill we would expect most children to have. Bridget, I'm going to come back to you in a second because it makes sense for me to
Please, Neve.
because I just want to say one and done, and I want to say the next because, and then I'll be quiet. One and done. Timers, timers. I love timers. Timers are fabulous, but let's think about them just very quickly like any other strategy where we think, I've got the strategy, why didn't the child do the thing? I think it all the time. I had a scenario the other day where we had it's 2 minutes till we start X, Y, and Z, and the SAM timer was turned upside down. And then the child was like, absolutely not. In 2 minutes' time, am I starting whatever it is you want me to do? So sometimes just stepping back, because I can feel a bit panicked when my strategy doesn't work. Oh, this is the thing that was supposed to help. And the idea is that the child will get used to that it's 2 minutes and then it's time to do X, Y, and Z. But maybe 2 minutes is fine transition time for me. If we think again of that proactive executive functioning, I hadn't actually said to that child when he came in, you're going to have 2 minutes of play and then we'll have to put them away. Or I hadn't let his mom know that was the plan so she could have prepared him for that in the car. Really, he sat and played, he was hyper focusing. I appeared with my lovely colourful timer and thought I was being very reasonable just because he could see the pretty sand go down, that he was going to have to make a shift in 2 minutes. So it's just being critical of the strategies that we use. Finally, in terms of the self advocacy piece, I really, really, really just want to emphasize that so many adults that I know who are neurodivergent and have executive functioning differences speak about themselves in the most self critical, you know, insulting way. And I can think of so many women that I work with, women in particular, who are neurodivergent and highly successful. Bridget being one of them, Amanda, Trina, so many people, but they will often say, but I'm such a disaster. I'm such a nightmare. I'm hopeless. I'm a mess. I'm a hot mess, etc. And I really have started to think about it in terms of that language had to come from somewhere. And that language comes from being a child in school and being told constantly, my God, you'd forget your hat if it wasn't on your head, or whatever the expression is. And actually, if we think about building the child up to develop their executive functioning, then surely self recrimination, when I think, oh my God, if I had to do an interview and I think, oh my God, I'm going to be so bad at that, I'm going to be so out of my depth, that doesn't motivate me to start working on it. When we're self recriminating, it doesn't help us to sequence through a task, it stops us doing a task. So it's great that now women in their 30s, their 40s are learning to say things like, listen, I work better when I've this in place. But I just think it's mind blowing to think of the power if, you know, a woman Bridget's age had learned that when she was 6, I didn't disclose her age, when she was 6 or 7, to be able to say, actually, teacher, in a respectful way, I learn better when. And that only comes through naming those differences and teaching about those differences. I work better when. If that language would be beyond your child at the moment, knowing how to ask help, knowing where their visual is for needing help. So instead of all of our energy going into how can I develop his executive functioning skills? How can I make him more organized? How can he be able to self advocate to get the support he needs in a situation to be able to succeed? Because that is a skill too. And if we ignore that skill until adulthood, then that's a that's a very quick ascent to suddenly understand. And B, I will come back to you to finish, and I'll read the
So
question.
to immediately disclose my age, that little 5-year-old Bridget was 22 years of lessons ago, which is math I did have to ask my husband for help with. Um, so these are all things that I've learned about my executive function, and some of them might be helpful, some of them might not. The two things that I very broadly wanted to make sure got across was the system that you have that works, that isn't perfect but works, is so much more valuable than the magical system that could work perfectly. And it was something that happened quite a lot in my childhood, that we would try for the perfect one when there was a good one, and the good one went away, and the perfect one didn't work. So we were left with nothing. So when adding perfect to good, keep the good there. make sure that the good stays, because restarting the good is just as hard as starting the perfect from nothing. The other thing is that there is no scheduling software and no expensive planner that will change your child's brain chemistry. And especially as neurodiversity becomes more culturally aware, this is someplace that people try to make a lot of money. And it is very easy to fall into this will fix everything because that's something that parents want very deeply. And there isn't always going to be a magical thing that you can buy that will make it better. And a lot of it is just strategies at home, strategies at school, strategies that could use a copybook from Tesco rather than €50 Panda notebook that has like goals for every week. Broadly, you and your child are worth actually figuring this out rather than being forced to go through this forever. Because I had no idea what was going on for ostensibly 22 years. And I managed to figure it out enough to go to university. It took 6 years, but I've got a degree on my wall. I have got a job. I've got a husband. I've got an apartment that works for me because I figured out how to set it up for myself in a way that works for me. Frankly, better than anything could have worked in my parents' home because it's not a home that I set up. The real life solutions that I use in the day to day make it a game. The thing that I am using most often now is this app called Finch. This is my Finch. Her name is Pebbles. I put in all of the tasks I have to do for the day. Once I go through 5 or 6 tasks in the morning, she goes off on an adventure and she learns things and she gets coins. And I buy her outfits with her coins. And then she goes off on her next day's adventure. And Adele loves Finch. Um, and well, I can set a particular task that is very important and that hatches these little pets for Pebbles. It's excellent. And it's like a Tamagotchi that reminds you to do your work. It's excellent. I love it. Make it cute, make it a story for yourself. One tip that I found on TikTok, of all places, was this girl who was helping herself to clean by making up fun stories for herself and like putting on a nice outfit and putting on music, like getting to the cleaning by pretending you're a rich 50s housewife and putting on Dean Martin. Like, make it good for yourself in ways that can entertain you. And one that I think Neve and I both touched on is make it easy to come back from failure. In As I Am, the general executive functioning tool is a scheduling software that simply does not work for me. It works wonderfully for Neve. So nothing against me or Neve or this scheduling software. It's just not my cup of tea. I use a paper planner and it has um, you can write in the days. It doesn't like have a set January, February, March. You write in the days of the week. You circle which month it is, which means that like if it takes you a while to come back after Christmas and you didn't write anything down in January, there's not a big blank block where January was supposed to be. You just go from December when you were very good at this to February when you were very good at this, and there's not like a giant month of shame. And it's figuring out these things that work and letting them shape a life and a school time and a work time that work for you, that work for your child. And it's bits and pieces, but I think that if we looked at neurotypical people under the same kind of microscope, that the ways that they cope is also bits and pieces. So I will pass back to Neve to wrap up, and then we'll do some Q&A, I think.
Thanks, B. And I never heard of Finch till today.
Excellent. Finch
Um,
is lovely.
I'm loyal to Monday.com. 2 seconds now. Just want to get
If as I am could switch fully from Monday.com to Finch, I think it would be a wonderful world.
just a couple more notes, just because I'll be annoyed I didn't mention them in terms of where your child might, I suppose, struggle to what you broadly are thinking of as organization. And in terms of objects of reference, because I did want to mention it, that can be helpful. So whether you're getting frustrated that he doesn't bring his key home or so on, or he doesn't remember to bring his key. One parent I know used that I always found quite entertaining was at night she would put the key into his school shoe. Because if you put your foot into a shoe, you are very likely to feel the key underneath your foot, and then that would go into his zipped pocket. So it would cue him. It's giving that cue. Another objective reference is, and I've seen these on TikTok in terms of bracelets. So if someone say, now this is say for an older child, but generalize it to the task you want your child to be successful in, you have something in the oven, that they have a bracelet that either has an O on it, something that will they can visually look and see, oh, oven is still on, a bath is still running, etc. So something on their person that they get an immediate visual cue of something where they've left the environment, because that out of sight, out of mind thing is a really particular one that comes up again and again. So setting your child up for success, if you think, oh God, they never throw away their wrappers, have you a bin very, very close to them, by the sofa, in their bedroom, in the bathroom, etc.? Is the cue you want them to follow there beside them to visually take in? Is there anything else? Just in terms of schoolwork as well, in terms of cueing, what's important? So, like Bridget said, a child could be given loads of instructions, but has the teacher actually cued them to what's the important part of this task? And the final thing I would say is that this webinar is recorded. There's lots of information in it. Treat it, like I always say, like a buffet. Take your favorite pancake from the stack and try and implement that, or try and reflect on that over the next week. Pick one slide and think about, how does that fit into my life? How will I make a change? Because remember, like Bridget mentioned at the start, when her mum would be like, new strategy, new strategy, new strategy. For an autistic person, that's change, 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 change. Even if that change is designed to support, we can't on the one hand say struggles with change, and on the other hand say, let's change the strategy every day. We're contradicting ourselves there. I know that there is many questions more broadly about education, rights and support. So just to let you know, on the Child and Family Support Programme, every month, myself and Michael, who is head of community support and a total policy king, and myself run a monthly almost town hall online where you can give us your question in advance. We prepare our answer. So it could be, my child can't get a school place, my child isn't getting their movement breaks, I'm worried about not getting school transport, and we work through those questions. So that takes monthly, and it takes place monthly, and anyone registered welcome to attend. And finally, myself and Amanda were chatting about, we might mention certain resources in webinars like this. Oh, it would be really helpful if you had a visual for that, or so on. And then that's then adding to your list as the parent of, well, where do I go and get that visual? So we make resources all the time, particularly Amanda does, but it would be really helpful for us if there was a particular resource you wanted to see As I Am create, a particular type of visual schedule, a particular type of reminder system, whatever it is, to give us ideas of what to create, and then we can link them to the webinars that we're doing. So I just wanted to speak to that. I do see some questions on PDA, which is super interesting because when we think of PDA and we think then of everything I've been saying about executive functioning, of breaking the instruction down so the person is getting even more and more instruction, and how challenging that could be for someone with PDA, or how that doesn't show an understanding of their needs. We have a webinar on PDA specifically, which maybe we can link when we send out this recording. We're probably due to update that as well. But very quickly, in terms of the language that we present instructions to someone with PDA, if a person doesn't have PDA, we tend to say, first we're going to take our coat off when we get home. Next, we're going to sit down for a snack. So we're really given quite a definite instruction there. Or we're asking, will you take off your coat? Will you sit down at the table? Will you get started with your homework? Generally speaking, when it comes to PDA, it's better accepted to use an approach of I'm going to have a snack now because I'm hungry after driving you home, and there's some there for you as well. I'm going to start to get ready for bed now, etc. To those who don't have a child with PDA, you may be judging and thinking, you can't talk to a child like that. For anyone who has a child with PDA, they will understand the need to how to approach things differently. So all of the strategies are still applicable, but it's the presentation of them that is so important. But we will send that PDA webinar out as well in this. There was a question on tried and tested, how long or what time frame before you move on. It's a little bit, unfortunately, and I hate when people say this to me, how long is a piece of string one. But I'd say it is one where you know your child best. And where it can be at odds is sometimes a school will want to continue with the strategy that you privately feel that is no longer working, but you worry if you say that because it's an autism strategy, then it'll be thought of, hopeless case, or well, we tried and X didn't work. So I think it is more about even starting to say, should we begin to consider that this strategy isn't working because of X, Y, and Z, and even in opening that discussion. Advocacy, I think I've spoken to Jackie, but the real take home there, I think, is making sure that documentation refers to executive functioning. Report there again, you shouldn't have to justify why your child can't do the expected typical behavior. If that's in the report, you have something objective to go from, and that should be then reflected in the student support plan. I did mean to say what can also be helpful there is if a child is transitioning, not just from school to another school, because if a child starts with a new teacher from junior infants to senior, that's a massive transition in itself. Saying to the teacher before the summer break, from an executive functioning point of view, because that's what we're talking about here, what are the things that you have found helpful for Betty? Can I get them documented so we can share with the next teacher? Because sometimes we can get really disappointed about how that communication can go. Obviously, there's examples where the communication between teachers is incredible. And there was something there on pausing. But I think we've spoken to that in terms of the processing speed. There is no real advantage to interrupting a child or an adult who's still processing a task. You are so much better to see a higher level of skill, a higher level of success when that extra time is given. But it's really important for the child to understand why and when they need that extra time. Dee, 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 dee um, road safety on for visuals. I know Amanda's on the call, so she'll be noting these down as well. Okay, just want to see if I missed anything else.
I did have a question on how to talk to your child about their diagnosis.
Yes, I saw that one at the top. Maybe what we could do, I know Amanda has a resource on that, so
Mhm.
and we actually have a video recording on that topic because that's a big one and we get lots of questions. So be delighted to send that out in the email. And I just
I'll
see
attach
the
that
last
as well.
one that I missed. Now, Bridget, if I've missed any questions, will send them to me, I know. But is transitions part of executive functioning? Just to hammer that home. Massive, massive, massive part. And we think of transitions as just autistic kids struggle with transitions. I don't know why. There's so many factors. The sensory processing, for example, when we go into a crowded school hall from a quiet classroom and processing that sensory stimuli, but also the one we often forget. We usually cater to the sensory one when it comes to transitions is that shift of we've changed context. I think of it as like a flashlight thinking. I need to move the flashlight. And we often think we're being reasonable with transition times, like me and my 2 minutes the other day to stop playing and moving into a less preferred activity. But 2 minutes is reasonable for me because I was happy to move on. So, from a cognitive shifting, I would say more time is usually needed to transition than we might think because we can't see the internal shifting. We can just see well, you've seen the timer, it's time to move on. So I would give more time rather than less. I feel like Bridget might uh, kick me off the call.
I
Um,
would never.
I just see one more just on visual planners, but doesn't remember to look at them. That's a big one. There
Yeah.
are apps where you can set, I actually used to use them a lot in the special school with children with a range of needs, but morning routine as well. So there are apps where you can input the visual schedule, but with timer. So it beeps for the child. And also, I remember one kid who loved when you tick something off, it had canned applause. But we also used to record maybe his favorite SNA saying amazing job. Now his favorite SNA changed regularly. So there was a lot of changing of recordings, but I find the apps particularly helpful for visual schedules. If you're thinking, I'm not going to have a visual schedule on the hop, I think it was Next Steps SLT I saw recommend this, which is very good idea. In your iPhone notes, or I'm sure there's the equivalent on Android, it is really easy to copy and paste a picture from your iPhone roll into your iPhone notes. So if you're caught in the hop and you think, okay, it's now going to be Granny picking her up because I have to go. I don't have a laminator with me because that's the thing about visual schedules. They take work. Even being able to use on your iPhone notes to copy and paste a picture of Granny or Granny's card, right there is a change, screenshot that, send to the teacher, send to your husband, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, who's ever with the child. So we can make those things on the hop as well. Also, objects of reference there. So, objects of reference are things that give us a visual cue without us almost having to check that something needs to be done. So, for example, the bracelet, or a way we used to use them in the classroom is we would hand items. So, if we wanted a child to keep something in their memory by the time they got to the other side, because we would have had kids with significant working memory issues. If I wanted we'll call him Billy to remember he was going to OT. He really associated this certain toy from the OT room. So we would hand him and he would have had significant intellectual disability. We would have handed him the toy and he would have walked with that to the OT room. Because otherwise, what was happening with his working memory, by the time he got to the OT room with me, he'd forgotten that's where we were going. And then that would cue a meltdown. And we did that with toilet, etc. Um, Turns out I could talk about executive functioning all night. Who knew? Okay, I'll leave it there, Bridget.
Okay.
Any other questions? Feel free to email, and if I've missed any, we'll have a look. And yeah, we would love any suggestions for resources that we could provide, because that will motivate us to do them.
And just worth noting, a lot of the questions that we haven't gotten to have been about specific areas of executive function around hygiene, like showering and brushing teeth. And we are having a webinar on autism and hygiene in the summer, I believe in June. So keep an eye out for that.
Will I say
Um,
something about that, Bridget, before we go?
go for it.
So, in the team resource, which is available on As I Am, it's called As We Are. There's lots of suggestions there in terms of, and Bridget worked a huge amount on that as well, in terms of adapting showering and other hygiene tasks to reduce the executive functioning demand. These things, particularly with teenagers, can get into battle of you will have washed hair to go to granny's house, rather than maybe the win there is clean clothes. And there's lots of simple strategies there to reduce the demand. Things like even, and I know it sounds weird, we have to think outside the box, putting deodorant on the child's top or uniform if you're worried they really won't, get into the shower before school and you're concerned if they smell, how that might impact them. If it's a sensory issue with using water in terms of from medical shops, etc., you can get large wipes that may be used as an interim. A sink bath takes a lot less physical energy than a get your whole body into the shower. And there's even things you'll think, oh, that's quite strange, but even if a child doesn't like getting completely undressed, a very large vest, for example, like a grandpa vest, but they're able to access their armpits, they're able to access their back, but they don't have to get fully undressed. If they don't like drying after the shower, the feeding of the towel, using a hair dryer to dry their skin. So Bridget's right, there will be a webinar specifically on that.
And
Now,
if that's how much information she has in 3 minutes, imagine how much she has in a full webinar.
yes, maybe. Okay, we'll leave it there. Sorry. Go and eat our dinner.
We'll leave it there. And I hope everyone has a happy Valentine's Day tomorrow. This should be up on the website tomorrow and will be sent out to you as well.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.